Keanu Reeves stood patiently at the airport security checkpoint, just another traveler in line, until a rude security officer singled him out. "Move it along, Grandpa. You think you're special or something?" the man barked, completely unaware of who he was speaking to. Passengers around them gasped, some whispering in disbelief. But Keanu? He just smiled, staying as calm as ever. What happened next would leave the entire airport in shock and make the officer instantly regret his words. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. Keanu Reeves stood in line at the airport security checkpoint. His posture relaxed, a worn-out backpack slung over his shoulder. Dressed in a simple hoodie, jeans, and well-worn sneakers, he blended in with the crowd. The usual airport chaos surrounded him. People hurriedly shuffling through security, rolling their suitcases along, some anxiously checking their phones, others sighing at the slow-moving line. Keanu, however, remained calm, his face carrying that quiet, almost meditative expression that made him stand out to those who took a second glance. He had always enjoyed people watching, observing the hurried lives around him without feeling the need to rush himself. But his peaceful moment was about to be interrupted. A tall, broad-shouldered security officer stood at the checkpoint, his face stern, his eyes scanning the line like a hawk. The man had been barking orders at travelers for the past hour, clearly irritated by the never-ending wave of passengers. He seemed to be looking for an outlet for his frustration, and as his gaze settled on Keanu, his lips curled in annoyance. As Keanu stepped forward to place his belongings in the plastic tray, the officer's voice rang out, loud and sharp. "Move it along, Grandpa. You think you're special or something?" A few people in line turned their heads, startled by the harshness in his tone. Some recognized Keanu immediately, their eyes widening in disbelief. But he simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that only made the security officer's irritation grow. "Come on," the officer huffed, folding his arms. "This isn't the red carpet, let's go." Keanu remained silent, unbothered, as he calmly placed his bag and jacket onto the conveyor belt. His quiet demeanor only seemed to fuel the officer's aggression. The murmurs in the line grew louder. A young man a few feet away muttered under his breath, "Does he even know who he's talking to?" Before anyone could step in, a sudden commotion erupted behind the security checkpoint. The sharp click of dress shoes echoed against the polished airport floors as a man in a dark uniform rushed toward them. His face was pale, his expression urgent. It was the head of airport security, and he was heading straight for them. The security checkpoint, once filled with the usual airport hum of rolling suitcases, beeping scanners, and tired conversations, had fallen into an almost eerie silence. Travelers who had previously been too preoccupied with their own schedules were now completely absorbed in the scene unfolding before them. Some leaned in slightly, as if trying to catch every word, while others exchanged wide-eyed glances, realizing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about long after they boarded their flights. The security officer, who only moments ago had been so full of confidence, now seemed frozen in place. His arms, once crossed defiantly over his chest, now hung stiffly at his sides. His face, which had been stern and authoritative, now showed flickers of doubt, confusion, and, most tellingly, it was clear that he was quickly piecing together the gravity of the situation. His eyes darted between the head of security, who stood rigid with barely concealed anger, and the man he had just insulted. A man who had done nothing to warrant the hostility he had received. A man who, in fact, could very well be one of the most respected and beloved figures in Hollywood. Keanu remained as he had been from the beginning, calm, composed, entirely unbothered. He hadn't even moved from his spot, still standing in front of the conveyor belt where his backpack and belongings sat untouched. He looked as if he had all the time in the world, as if none of this commotion even fazed him. It was this quiet demeanor that seemed to rattle the officer the most. He had expected a reaction, any reaction. He was used to people rolling their eyes, huffing in frustration, maybe even arguing back. But this level of self-control, of patience, of sheer unshakable presence, It unnerved him. And now, with dozens of eyes on him and at least a handful of people recording, he suddenly felt like the ground beneath him was disappearing. The head of security exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if this was the last thing he wanted to deal with today. Then, with a slow, measured breath, he straightened his back and turned to face the officer. His voice, when he spoke, was low, firm, and dangerous. "I'm going to ask you again," he said. "What exactly did you say to him?" The officer hesitated. His mind was racing. If he admitted it outright, he would look even worse. If he tried to deny it, there were too many witnesses, and far too many cameras, for that to work in his favor. He was trapped, and he knew it. His throat felt dry. "I didn't mean anything by it," he finally stammered. "I was just trying to keep the line moving." A scoff came from someone in the crowd. "Yeah, sure you were," a woman muttered under her breath. The head of security's eyes narrowed. "Oh, you were just trying to keep the line moving?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. "That's interesting, because from what I just heard, it sounded a lot like you were verbally harassing a passenger." The officer opened his mouth to protest, but the head of security wasn't finished. "And not just any passenger," he continued. "You do realize who this man is, don't you?" The officer's jaw clenched. His mind scrambled for something to say, but he had nothing. Before he could even attempt an excuse, the young man who had spoken earlier shook his head in disbelief. "Dude," he said, his tone exasperated. "That's Keanu friggin' Reeves." A ripple of low laughter spread through the crowd, though the officer was in no position to appreciate the irony. The color drained from his face as the full weight of what he had done settled over him. This wasn't just a random traveler he had insulted. This was Keanu Reeves, a man whose reputation for kindness, humility, and generosity was practically legendary. A man who, despite his fame, was known for treating everyone with respect. A man who had never once used his status to belittle others. And yet, here he was, being humiliated by someone who had no idea who he was dealing with. Keanu's lips twitched slightly, as if he were fighting the urge to chuckle at the absurdity of it all. The officer was now visibly sweating. "I didn't recognize him." The head of security let out a sharp, humorless laugh. No kidding. More people in the crowd chuckled. The tension in the room had shifted, not in the officer's favor. "Do you have any idea," the head of security continued, "how bad this looks, not just for you, but for all of us?" The officer swallowed hard. His bravado had vanished completely. "I wasn't trying to—" "Oh, I know what you were trying to do," the head of security interrupted coldly, "and I'm going to tell you exactly what's going to happen next." The officer's stomach twisted into knots. "Step into my office, now." Silence fell over the room. The officer hesitated, glancing around as if searching for a way out, but there was none. The weight of the crowd's stares, the quiet hum of people still recording. It was suffocating. Keanu, for his part, simply sighed softly, shaking his head ever so slightly, as if he felt second-hand embarrassment for the man. The officer turned, moving stiffly toward the exit. His entire body felt like lead. The head of security lingered for a moment longer, then turned back to Keanu. "Sir," he said, his voice softer now, heavy with regret. "I can't apologize enough for what just happened." Keanu finally spoke again, his voice gentle and unwavering. "It's all right," he said. But everyone watching knew it wasn't. The atmosphere at the security checkpoint had completely shifted. What had started as a routine airport procedure had now turned into a full-blown spectacle. Travelers who moments ago were impatiently waiting for their turn now stood in rapt attention, whispering among themselves. More phones were discreetly raised, capturing every detail of what was happening. The security officer's once confident demeanor had crumbled. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him, suffocating him in a way he had never experienced before. His face was tight with tension, his hands balled into fists at his sides, but he was no longer in control here. He knew it. The head of security knew it, and worst of all, the crowd knew it. Keanu, however, remained completely unfazed, as if none of this involved him at all. He stood with effortless composure, his hands resting at his sides, his expression neutral. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't reveling in the officer's growing discomfort. In fact, if anything, he almost looked bored. But that only made it worse. The officer felt his throat tighten. The pressure was unbearable, the weight of so many eyes, the whispers, the unmistakable sound of cameras capturing his every movement. He could feel his career slipping through his fingers with each passing second. The head of security exhaled sharply. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. The officer's eyes flickered with panic. "Sir, I was just..." "Enough." The word cracked through the air like a whip. The entire terminal seemed to hold its breath. The head of security squared his shoulders, his face a mask of controlled fury. "You would..." "But just what?" he demanded. "Just insulting a passenger? Just humiliating someone in front of an entire crowd?" His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "Just making a complete fool out of yourself?" The officer flinched. The crowd was dead silent now, the only sound coming from the soft hum of the conveyor belt moving luggage through the scanners. "You save it." The head of security cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. He took a step closer, lowering his voice, but the authority in his tone didn't waver. "Do you have any idea what kind of disaster you've just created? Do you understand what's going to happen when this gets out?" The officer swallowed hard. His hands, once firm on his hips in authority, now twitched slightly. He didn't need to ask what the man meant. He already knew. This was a PR nightmare. Keanu Reeves was one of the most beloved actors in the world. The internet practically worshipped him for his kindness, his humility, and his ability to treat everyone, whether a fan, a stranger, or a janitor, with the same level of respect. And he had just publicly humiliated him. The moment these videos hit social media, it would spread like wildfire. Within hours, the entire world would know what had happened. By tomorrow, major news outlets would be picking it up, and by the end of the week, he could very well be out of a job. He felt sick. His eyes darted toward Keanu, who was now casually adjusting the strap of his backpack. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look mildly irritated. That almost made it worse. If Keanu had reacted, maybe the situation wouldn't feel so suffocating. But instead, he had handled the entire thing with nothing but quiet grace, making the officer look like the only aggressor. The head of security sighed, rubbing his temple again before turning back to Keanu. "Sir, again, I deeply apologize for..." Keanu raised a hand, stopping him. His voice was calm and even. "There's no need," he said simply. The head of security hesitated. "But..." "It's fine," Keanu continued, his tone carrying a quiet finality. "Let's just move on." The words were spoken so lightly, so effortlessly, that for a second it almost seemed like the tension would dissolve. Almost. But the crowd wasn't done yet. A voice rang out from behind. "Oh, come on," someone scoffed. "You're seriously just gonna let him walk away after that?" The officer turned sharply, his pulse spiking. The voice belonged to a young woman, probably in her late 20s, with sharp eyes and an unimpressed expression. Her arms were crossed over her chest, her phone still recording in her hand. "You don't get to talk to people like that and then just walk away," she continued. "That's not how this works." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. The officer's breathing quickened. His skin felt clammy. Keanu, on the other hand, only sighed softly, as if he had expected this. The head of security let out another sigh, this one heavier. He glanced at the officer, his expression unreadable, then turned back to the woman. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked. The woman smirked. "I don't know. Maybe he should try apologizing?" A ripple of approval passed through the onlookers. The officer's stomach twisted into knots. He could already tell there was no way out of this. If he refused, he'd look even worse. If he did apologize, he'd be doing it on camera and the video would be replayed everywhere. His palms felt sweaty. He clenched them into fists. Keanu, noticing the obvious struggle on the man's face, gave a small, almost amused sigh. Then, turning fully to the officer for the first time, he tilted his head slightly and said, "I think they have a point." It was spoken so casually, so effortlessly, that it somehow carried more weight than any demand ever could. The officer swallowed hard. He could feel the expectation radiating from every person in the room. He was cornered. And worst of all, he knew he deserved it. The officer stood motionless, his face pale, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. His entire body burned with humiliation as the weight of the moment settled over him. He had no choice. The crowd was waiting. The head of security was waiting. Keanu was waiting. He swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing out the words like they physically pained him. "I'm sorry." His voice was low, barely above a whisper. It was as if he hoped saying it quietly would make it less real, but the head of security was having none of it. "Louder," he snapped. The officer stiffened. His pride fought back, screaming at him to resist, to hold his ground, to not cave in like this. But he had lost control of the situation long ago. He knew it. The crowd knew it. And worst of all, Keanu knew it too. The legendary actor remained completely calm, his expression unreadable. He wasn't smirking, wasn't reveling in the officer's downfall. He just stood there, quiet and composed, waiting, not demanding, just waiting. And somehow that made it even worse. The officer's throat tightened. His face felt like it was on fire. "I'm sorry," he muttered again, this time loud enough for the crowd to hear. It wasn't much of an apology. His voice was stiff, forced, completely devoid of sincerity. But it was something. Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering him, and then, to everyone's surprise, he gave a small nod. Not of approval, necessarily, but as if to acknowledge the effort. He didn't rub it in, he didn't make the officer repeat it. He just let it go. And somehow, that made the humiliation even worse. The head of security, on the other hand, wasn't ready to let it slide so easily. His expression remained stern as he turned to his disgraced employee. "You will be writing a full report on this incident," he said, his tone sharp and commanding. "And after your shift, you will be meeting with management to discuss further action." The meaning behind those words was clear. This wasn't going to end here. The officer felt a cold sweat break out along the back of his neck. He knew what that meant. He knew what was coming. A review, a formal report, a possible suspension, maybe even termination, all because he couldn't keep his temper in check. Keanu, meanwhile, had already moved on. He stepped toward the conveyor belt, retrieving his backpack with the same unbothered grace he had carried throughout the entire encounter. Slinging it over his shoulder, he adjusted the strap, checking to make sure he had all his belongings before stepping forward. It was over. For him, but for the officer, it was just beginning. Because as soon as Keanu turned and casually walked away, the silence in the security checkpoint exploded into murmurs. Travelers whispered among themselves, their voices filled with excitement, amusement, and disbelief. It was insane. "I cannot believe that just happened." It was literally recording the whole thing. "Oh my God, you know this is gonna go viral." A soft ripple of laughter ran through the crowd. A few people had their phones raised, still recording, their screens glowing in the dim terminal light. The officer's stomach twisted painfully. He knew what was coming. One clip. One single viral clip of him yelling at Keanu Reeves, acting like a complete fool, and his reputation would be destroyed. Within hours, social media would be flooded with the footage. People would be reposting it, adding captions like, "Security guard insults Keanu Reeves, instantly regrets it," and "Man screams at the nicest actor in Hollywood, big mistake." By tomorrow, it would be everywhere. News outlets would pick it up, bloggers would write about it, people would meme it. And the worst part? No one would ever forget. The officer stood frozen, unable to move, as Keanu's figure disappeared into the terminal. The whispers continued. The cameras stayed raised. And as reality sank in, the security officer felt something he hadn't expected. A deep, gut-wrenching, inescapable sense of regret. The atmosphere in the security checkpoint was still charged with an energy that refused to dissipate. Even though Keanu Reeves had already walked away, the murmurs of the crowd continued to ripple through the air like distant thunder. People whispered to one another, exchanging incredulous looks, shaking their heads, chuckling under their breaths. Some had already put away their phones after capturing the entire ordeal, while others kept them out, likely rewatching the footage before deciding how best to frame their viral posts. The security officer, however, was frozen in place. His face was drained of color, his arms rigid at his sides. The confidence, the arrogance that had fueled him just moments ago was completely gone. He knew what was coming. The fallout was inevitable. The head of security gave him a hard look, then jerked his head toward the side hallway leading to the security offices. "Let's go," he said, his voice sharp and final. The officer hesitated. For a brief, wild moment, he considered making some last-ditch effort to defend himself. Maybe he could argue that it was just a misunderstanding, that he hadn't really meant to be disrespectful. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was pointless. The crowd, the head of security, the passengers who had watched it unfold, they had all seen the truth. Worse, they had recorded it. There was no way out of this. Swallowing hard, he forced his legs to move, following the head of security through the corridor. He could still hear them, the travelers, the witnesses. Their voices followed him, biting at his heels like snapping dogs. He really thought he could talk to Keanu Reeves like that and get away with it? Imagine how he treats regular people. This is going to be everywhere by tonight. The officer clenched his jaw, his nails digging into his palms as he walked. His uniform suddenly felt suffocating, like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. For the first time in his career, he truly regretted something he had done. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves walked through the airport terminal, his expression calm, but thoughtful. He moved with the same quiet ease he always carried, as though the incident had barely registered. Other passengers glanced at him as he passed, some smiling in recognition, others giving him subtle nods of respect. He returned each gesture with the same warmth, never breaking stride. But in his mind, something lingered. This wasn't the first time he had been treated differently because someone didn't recognize him. It happened from time to time. Waiters scoffing at him in fancy restaurants, salespeople assuming he couldn't afford something, hotel staff dismissing him as just another tired traveler. And every time, he reacted the same way. With patience, with kindness, with quiet dignity. But this time, something about the experience unsettled him. He wasn't upset for himself. He had long since learned how to brush off rudeness. But what about the others? Keanu had the luxury of public support. The moment people realized who he was, the situation changed. People rushed to defend him. The officer panicked. The head of security intervened. But what if it had been someone else? What if it had been an elderly man who did move a little slower? What if it had been a nervous first-time traveler who didn't know the procedures? What if it had been a mother juggling two young children, struggling to keep everything in order? Would the officer have spoken to them the same way? Would anyone have stepped in? The thought didn't sit right with him. Keanu glanced around the terminal, watching the steady flow of travelers making their way through the vast airport. People rushing to their gates, parents pulling along children, businessmen in suits checking their watches, students with overstuffed backpacks looking slightly lost. Thousands of lives, all moving forward. He exhaled softly. His flight wasn't for another hour. And so, instead of heading straight to his gate, he made a quiet decision. He turned and walked toward the airport's customer service desk. The woman behind the counter looked up as he approached, her professional smile quickly shifting into one of surprise. Her eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Mr. Reeves," she blurted out, clearly caught off guard. "How can I help you?" Keanu smiled politely. "Hi, I was just wondering, who should I speak to about filing a formal report on one of your security officers?" The woman blinked. Keanu Reeves, one of the most well-known and beloved actors in the world, wanted to file a formal complaint? She had expected him to let it go. That's what most celebrities did. Most people, famous or not, would have just walked away, shaking their heads at the bad experience and moving on. But Keanu Reeves wasn't most people. He didn't hold grudges. He wasn't interested in revenge. This wasn't about him. This was about making sure it didn't happen to someone else. And Keanu Reeves wasn't the kind of man to ignore something that mattered. The woman behind the counter hesitated for a second, clearly processing what was happening. She had expected Keanu Reeves to simply shake off the incident and continue on his way, just like most celebrities would. But here he was, standing in front of her, calm yet determined, asking to take action, not for himself, but for everyone else who might experience the same A report? She repeated, still slightly flustered. Keanu gave a small nod, his voice steady but without any trace of anger. "Yes, I understand that security officers have a difficult job, but I also believe that all passengers, should be treated with respect." The woman straightened slightly, realizing this was serious. Her professionalism kicked in, and she quickly reached for a folder behind the counter, flipping through a stack of documents before pulling out a form. "Of course, Mr. Reeves. Our customer relations team handles reports about staff behavior. You can fill this out here, or I can take your statement and submit it for you." Keanu took the form and skimmed over it briefly. His brows furrowed slightly in thought. He had no intention of getting someone fired, nor was he filing this report out of revenge. That wasn't who he was. But the moment replayed in his mind. How quickly that officer had dismissed him. How easily he had resorted to belittling a passenger simply because he thought he could. Keanu had handled it just fine. But what about the next person? What if it was someone who didn't have the confidence to brush it off? Someone elderly or someone struggling with a language barrier? What if it had been a young traveler, anxious and unfamiliar with airport procedures, who was simply trying to get through security? Would they have been treated just as poorly? Would anyone have stepped in for them? The thought sat heavily in his chest. He pulled a pen from his pocket and began writing. The woman behind the counter watched in quiet amazement. She had dealt with difficult customers before, people who raised their voices over minor inconveniences, who demanded special treatment. But Keanu Reeves was different. He wasn't making a scene. He wasn't looking for attention. He was simply doing the right thing. He took his time, ensuring he documented the incident fairly, not embellishing, not exaggerating. When he was done, he handed back the form, meeting her gaze with that same quiet kindness he was known for. "Thank you for taking this seriously," he said. The woman gave him a respectful nod. "No, thank you, sir. I promise this will be reviewed immediately." Keanu gave her a polite smile before adjusting the strap of his backpack and turning to walk toward his gate. As he moved through the terminal, the energy around him felt different. People were still watching, still whispering, still casting him glances filled with admiration. Some subtly nodded at him as if to say, "We saw what you did. That was incredible." He didn't acknowledge it. He didn't need to. For him, it had never been about recognition. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about knowing that maybe the next time a traveler passed through this airport, they'd be treated just a little better. And for Keanu Reeves, that was enough. The airport slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Travelers bustled through the terminal, announcements echoed overhead, and the security checkpoint resumed its endless cycle of scanning, beeping, and shuffling passengers along. But the incident that had just unfolded remained fresh in everyone's minds. As Keanu Reeves disappeared toward his gate, the murmurs of admiration still lingered. A few travelers who had witnessed the confrontation smiled to themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others quietly typing away on their phones, undoubtedly crafting the first viral posts about what they had just seen. Back at the security offices, the disgraced officer sat stiffly in a chair, his hands gripping the armrests like they were the only thing keeping him grounded. The head of security stood before him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You don't realize how badly you just messed up," the man finally said, exhaling sharply. "You didn't just yell at a passenger, you yelled at Keanu Reeves." The officer swallowed hard. He had already played the scene over in his mind a dozen times. Each replay made his stomach twist tighter. The head of security shook his head in frustration. "And if that wasn't bad enough, you did it in front of half the terminal. People recorded you. That video is probably online right now." The officer didn't respond. He knew there was nothing he could say that would fix this. A long silence stretched between them before the head of security spoke again, his voice lower but still firm. "Look, I don't know if this will cost you your job, that's for management to decide. But let me be very clear. You brought this on yourself. And if you don't learn from it, I guarantee this won't be the last time you regret how you treat people." The words landed hard. The officer stared down at the floor, feeling the weight of his own actions in a way he never had before. Meanwhile, Keanu had reached his gate, where a few airport employees were waiting. One of them, a young woman in a crisp uniform, gave him a small, grateful smile. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "I just wanted to say, that was really cool of you." Keanu raised an eyebrow slightly. "What was?" She chuckled. "What you did back there. You could have just walked away, but you stood your ground. And you handled it better than most people ever would." Keanu shrugged, his expression as humble as ever. "It wasn't about me," he said simply. "Just wanted to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." The woman nodded, clearly impressed. "Well, I think you made an impact." Keanu gave her a small, warm smile before boarding his flight. By the time he took his seat and settled in, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from a friend. "Dude, you trending again?" Keanu sighed through his nose, shaking his head with amusement before putting his phone away. Another day, another viral moment. But if it meant that even one person out there would think twice before treating someone unfairly, then maybe it was worth it. By the time Keanu's flight was in the air, the internet had already exploded. The video had gone viral. Thousands of comments pouring in, praising his patience, his humility, his quiet but powerful way of handling injustice. Keanu Reeves is truly one of a kind. Imagine being this guy and realizing you just yelled at the Keanu Reeves. Moral of the story: always treat people with kindness. You never know who you're talking to. Meanwhile, the security officer's face was everywhere. His actions were dissected, criticized, turned into memes. But more importantly, the conversation shifted. People began sharing their own stories of being mistreated by airport staff, of being dismissed, humiliated, spoken down to. The message was clear: respect shouldn't be reserved only for the famous. And as Keanu leaned back in his seat, gazing out at the clouds, he didn't need to check his phone to know today something had changed for the better.